Um, so welcome to this last session of Introduction to Narratology. We are today going to speak about narratives in art. This is kind of also a little bit of a very long trailer or a pilot for the seminar that I'm going to hold in the next semester, which is entirely focusing on narratives in art with sessions on conceptual problems that will probably mainly occupy us today, but then also artworks. Brian, my responsibility. Okay. So today we are going to start with that theme. Initially, I thought we would do the direct follow-up on last week's session with the enrichment economy and how that relates to artworks. But as the person who's going to present that isn't here yet, I think we'll keep it for the end, which for me somehow makes sense in terms of how the discussion went, because of course all the things we're discussing in terms of narrative in art are primary in terms of their temporal and even, like, I think, conceptual development. Because the question of narrative in art has been a central question since the Renaissance, basically when art was conceptualized mainly as a narrative activity. So where Renaissance artists would even speak of their paintings as historie, so histories. Speaking of history, painting was just paraphrased by historie, which ties back to Aristotle's heritage when he speaks about mythos in his Poetics, which is maybe the first narratological text in a certain sense that's still read quite actively, where he makes a distinction between two kinds of mimesis, what he calls haplemimesis, which is simple mimesis, and mimesis by diegesis. And that's kind of strange because diegesis is normally supposed to be opposed to mimesis. And here he makes it a second term to distinguish two types of mimesis. And there's quite some scholarship around that question. But the simple mimesis is something that we would see in theater, where the imitation through diegesis is more linked to what we would see in epic, for instance. And then a big question is if there can be a mimesis, or that if you can tell stories, if there can be a diegesis through mimetic means, which would be telling a story, for instance, through pictures, but he doesn't make it quite explicit. So people who have been thinking about the question of visual narratives sometimes go back to Aristotle and are like, Aristotle already talks about it, but he doesn't make it very clear in this text. Even, yeah. So that's kind of the part of the origin. And then in the Renaissance, people speak about historie, talking about their paintings, because history painting is supposed to be the most noble genre. Don't know if you're aware of that, but there was of course a distinction of genres, and still life is one genre, portraiture is another, landscape painting is a later genre. And there was a very clear doctrine that said that the history painting, which is a narrative genre, or maybe the narrative genre by excellence, is supposed to be the most noble one because it's concerned with human affairs, it's with actors interacting and so forth. Whereas all the other forms, and then this would typically reproduce maybe what you would consider, Jesse, sort of a prejudice towards the human action, of course, because when you only depict objects, it's not quite as noble. It's not supposed to be as difficult. It's supposed to be the hardest to depict people and their emotion, as opposed to depicting, for instance, landscape, or inanimate objects, or even animals. Even though landscape is a very late invention in the history of painting, only starts basically with Patinier, at least that's the canonical story that's being told, who first still introduces some scenes of sort of religious nature with Mary Magdalene somewhere in a landscape, or Saint Hieronymus somewhere in a landscape, and suddenly there's this kind of inversion of the hierarchies, where initially it's always the mythological or religious scene that's in the center, and then the landscape kind of serves as a backdrop. And then at one point in time in this Flemish painting, an inversion starts to happen, and people have been wondering about that inversion, whether it was linked maybe to religious concerns, where people were afraid that the viewer could identify the depicted scenes as being really present. And then one way to compensate for that is to say, well, we put them so small that you can't really start praying to them, that you can't like have the feeling, you can't have this confusion that would be heretic of thinking that what is being depicted is really there. Well, but the truth is that even this painting, considered to be narrative painting in the tradition of history painting that developed mainly in Renaissance Italy, is not telling full-blown stories in a very strict sense of the word, because the viewers already knew the stories. So they could actually just, if you showed a man and a woman who are both naked, and the woman is handing over an apple to the man, everybody would it would trigger the story of Adam and Eve in the religious viewer for whom this painting was made. But if you don't know that, you could just think that there's a woman and a man exchange an apple, or when you look at these paintings again, you'll realize that very often it looks like this woman is feeding an apple to a snake, because why would a snake be giving an apple to a woman? I mean, it doesn't even make a lot of sense when we use our ordinary way of thinking. So a lot of these paintings somehow don't seem to really convey the stories, but rather trigger or evoke them. But that wasn't seen as a problem for very long. And people still spoke as if the pictures actually told the stories. One interesting element, of course, of this possibility of hinting back at a story that everybody knows is then you can start working with your way to tell a story. And when you look at Adam and Eve in a certain drawing by Dürer, you get a very different feeling of what's happening. For instance, there's this one drawing where Adam and Eve are holding each other, and they're like taking the apple together at the same time. And it looks like they're actually experimenting together. Whereas you have other depictions where you will have Eve clearly taking it from the snake and handing it over to Adam, which ties in with the idea of a culpability of women much better. So somehow you can subvert the textual narrative in your way of depicting it when you have narratives that everybody already knows, because you're kind of free from telling what actually happened, and then you can give your perspective on what happened, and even sort of subtly subvert the traditional narrative. There's on the other side of the spectrum of this Adam and Eve, which I once studied because I found it particularly interesting. There's a drawing, sort of sketchy drawing by Rembrandt, and he also made a similar engraving afterwards, where you can see Eve handing over the apple, and Adam is like, and it's like, oh, you're giving me something terrible. And of course, it's also like saying, making it clear that he's not the culprit. He's not to be blamed. And of course, I mean, all these things kind of tie in with a certain, with the way women were treated in the Catholic Church, and so on and so forth. So there is a propagandistic element to this way of depicting well-known stories. That's pretty interesting to look at, and also how, for instance, the cross as the symbol, as the small symbol, will already appear in drawings, for instance, or in engravings of people who are supposed to be contemporaries of Jesus, as if immediately after the death of Jesus they had started using the symbol that's then used by the church. So kind of by depicting a past which is relevant to your agenda, you can kind of insert elements into this past that you will then use in the present, to kind of make them a logical element of your cult, for instance. So there are all of these like things that may look like details. There's even a very famous scene, I think, by Roger van der Weyden, where you have the nativity. So Jesus is just being born, and you already have a cross in the nativity, which is of course a foreshadowing in a certain way of the Passion, but which also has for us a feeling of a paradox, of course, that there would already be a cross in a nativity scene. So there are all these interesting ways in which artists could comment on the narratives they were depicting, as much as retelling them, or even more than retelling them, because they were free from this weight of the understandability of the full narrative based on their works. However, in the 18th century, people started to feel maybe uncomfortable with that, or felt the need to theoretically account for the fact that the story is actually not really being told in the picture, and we're starting to question this doctrine, which was linked to that ut pictura poiesis. That means that painting is a mute poetry, and that poetry is a speaking painting, which was a saying that was always quoted and quoted over again by Quintilius. And in this questioning of the idea that actually painting and literature function very much alike, one major figure is Lessing, which is why I put him on the reading list, because he really starts what we would then now call media specificity. So he's actually at the origin of two developments. One is the idea that each medium has its particular capacities, abilities, things you can do with it, and things you should do with it based on this specificity, which is interesting in relationship to Lessing, because it becomes much more normative. People like erect it into a norm, because you could say, okay, it's not so easy to tell stories with paintings. Doesn't matter, we can still do it, right? But at one point people say, well, it's not so easy. Actually, the medium is not made for it. So let's stop doing that. And let's tell stories in words, and maybe use painting for other purposes. One, of course, interesting element in relationship to this transition from a word-based medium into a picture-based form, which happens when you depict mythological tales, or when you depict scenes from the Bible, is that in the text, there's a certain kind of indeterminacy that you don't have in the picture. So for instance, when you think of a scene like the liberation of Saint Peter by an angel, which is something I wrote about once, you will realize that the text says Saint Peter was guarded by several guards. There were guards in front of the door. There were guards outside the prison. And then an angel came and liberated him. And that's it. The Bible says then an angel came and liberated him. But how are you going to depict that as an artist? How are you going to show that he's like super guarded, but that he was simply liberated by the angel? The Bible doesn't have to tell you how it looked, right? And then you have this blank, which is a kind of, in visual terms, is a blank, but within the convention of, of at least traditional painting, you can't just leave a blank in the painting. So you have to like find a way to show that the guards are there, but at the same time they were able to escape. And there are two solutions, which for me show a very different way of thinking of, and maybe I should show a few pictures about that, but for me show a very different way of thinking about that scene. You have the version by Raphael, for instance, in the Stanze dell'Eliodore in the Vatican, of the liberation, where you will see the guards doing one thing, which is rather expected. Let me activate my screen share briefly. Which is basically, what is it? Just share the desktop. Which is basically, as you see here, they have fallen asleep. Okay, which is kind of naturalizing the miracle in a way. And this is also interesting because it has a continuous space with different moments, which is something which has become rather rare. So it's one solution to deal with the problem of a spatial medium in which you want to tell temporal developments. You show first one scene, which is the angel comes into this prison. And what's amazing here is like the depiction of the prison, because the prison basically is the front wall. You see this grid of the prison here. I have another freeing where you can see it more explicitly. But it's like, for me, it's like an amazing way to depict imprisonment is to actually make the wall of the painting the prison wall somehow. See, we're not like, so it's like absolutely locked off, and it somehow also could be seen like a metaphor of the state of the viewer who can't really access pictorial space. So you could see this even as a reflection on pictorial space as a space that is, as one theorist put it, an abnormal space, which is there, but in which you can't act. You can't intervene, and here you actually shut off. And our shutting out of the pictorial space is actually made explicit by this grid. And then you see him leading the saint out of prison, with the guards being still asleep here. And then in the morning they wake up. You can kind of see that morning, that dusk has come, and they're looking for him. So this is a polychronic narrative, which is slightly discontinuous. So polychronic as in showing several moments in one picture plane, but there's some discontinuity in between the different moments because of these walls and so on and so forth. So it kind of naturalizes it, but they're sleeping. And there's another version, which personally I like a lot, which is by Konrad Witz, and can be seen in Geneva, where the saint is, so it's the same story, and you still have this blank, which is he was guarded, but then the angel came and freed him. But a very different treatment. I hope I can make this big. Sorry, I didn't prepare for them. Yeah, so you see actually that there's no one sleeping. No one is sleeping, they're all awake, but they have to let it happen somehow. So in terms of a kind of traditional logic, it's impossible to imagine that the guard would be that close, grabbing his axe, and he couldn't stop the freeing of Saint Peter by the angel. But of course, this is not conventional logic. This is a miracle. So for me, here he doesn't disarm the miracle. Witz doesn't disarm the miracle. Showing the guards as sleeping is like, yeah, sure, people can sleep. You somehow take away the miraculousness of the miracle. Whereas if you show it like that in bright daylight, with the guards just being incapable of stopping this liberation, you somehow keep the miraculousness intact as you transition from one medium to the other. Anyway, so these are some of the issues related to that question. And again, this is a polychronic image with several moments within the same pictorial space. And you see that it's more continuous than the Raphael. So this idea of continuity is kind of gradual. Here you have like a space where you don't have a wall or anything, but yet you see different moments on the same picture plane. Okay, but this element, and maybe that's something we'll talk about after. This idea of showing several moments in a picture, in one picture plane, is a traditional solution to the problem of temporality that you have when you only have one frame, basically. You have a freeze frame. And in order to introduce several moments which are constitutive of narrative, where you have one thing happening first and after and so on and so forth. So that's a traditional solution that was used probably since the cave paintings in Lascaux, where some people argue that you have horses who are shown in different positions. A guy called Marc Azema from France wrote a whole book about polychrony in cave painting. You have it also in Greek antiquity. You have it in all kinds of cultures. There's Maya vase painting, classic Maya vase painting that uses this polychronic device. But it has come to us to appear primitive or naive, as some people will say. Even researchers will call it naive, because we're so used to the idea that one frame equals one moment. But there's nothing necessary about that at all. It's just a convention that we kind of erected into the nature of the picture. And this comes to be questions in the Renaissance, and by the 18th century, people radically oppose it. So Lessing is one of the persons opposing that solution. And we will now hear how kind of his theory plays out, because we have a talk on Lessing by Aladdin. Is that right?
Yes, it's right. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, good. I will just try to share my screen because I prepared yeah. Can you see the PDF basically?
Not yet.
No, yeah. Okay. Now?
Yeah. Now you're starting. Okay. Amazing. Nice.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. So today I will present to you the book called Laocoon, or The Limit of Painting and Poetry. It's an essay wrote by Lessing in 1766. The book is considered as his masterpiece, basically, and it has been widely used and criticized in many fields of research. So today we'll go through a short presentation of this book and his idea about painting and poetry through the point of view of narratology, and with the question in mind, how this essay could help us to take a stance if painting could carry narrative or not. For the notice, I didn't read the entire book, I just read the edited version that we received. So the presentation will go in the following order. I will just quickly introduce the author, then I will talk about Lessing definition and main arguments, then it's the laws he proposed for new art, inspired by the ancients, and then his argument in relationship to the topic of the class, and then Lessing and the sculpture of Laocoon, and finally a short conclusion and discussion about it. So Lessing, called Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, he was a German writer and philosopher, and he's born in 1729 and he died in 1781. He's considered as a perfect representation of the Enlightenment era, and his work have largely influenced the German literature. So Lessing critiqued the modern era by using antiquity, where, according to his words, the ancient were prudent spirits aiming for calm inquiry, which preserved from the vice of exaggeration on the one hand and of culpable negligence on the other. The moderns, on the contrary, often try to amplify nature. They fancy to convert ancient little pleasure ways into great high roads. Those new high roads could often mislead us and lose track with wilderness. Hence, the law he proposes for the arts go back to antiquity, but not in resemblance, but in difference. The main idea of Lessing is to divide the arts into categories for which they are the best suited to be useful. So before going to the main argument of the book, it's important to understand how Lessing divides painting and what he called poetry. So according to his words, he say, like, finally, it is proper to mention that under the general term painting, I desire to be understood the art of design in all of the department. So for him, painting regroups sculpture, painting, drawing, photography, not at the time, but like, yeah, all those that he called design. And under poetry, we could put any type of prose or poetry that use actually a linear way of telling stories. So the main argument of Lessing is to reframe the difference between painting and poetry and create a clear division between those two fields. So he tried to create a rivalry between poets and painters. He created what we could call like a sort of the great divide. For him, as Klaus said previously, I mean, he used this quote from we call the Greek Voltaire, painting is mute poetry and poetry speaking painting. And painting and poetry are divided by what they should ultimately represent. If body is the domain of painting, then action is the domain of poetry. As he says, time is the sphere of the poet and space that of the painter. For example, poetry must restrict itself from portraying the corporal beauty or neither beauty in detail, but should actually talk more about the idea of beauty than beauty itself, for example. In the contrary, painting should focus on space and bodies, like Lessing say, painting employing figures and colors in space. Consequently, bodies with their visible property are the legitimate subject of painting. Moreover, what he says about painting is like, it's about fixing a particular moment. And for him, this moment has to be transitory. And we'll come back to that later, but the moment you fix is really important for Lessing. So I did a little graphic way of showing basically the laws he's proposing. So he's proposing that painting law is about representing bodies, space, using natural signs and selecting a transitory moment, and that poetry laws would be about actions, story, the use of conventional signs and in a linear way. So according to you, Klaus, before Lessing put it in question, in his book, it was quite taken for granted that picture could tell narrative. Following your analysis, Lessing created a fundamental difference between signs that coexist in space and signs that follow each other in time, which means that, for example, a painting assembles signs, but not in a linear way, but in a spatial way. Hence, according to that, picture cannot tell story. But Lessing's idea is that sign in space cannot show temporal developments. Another point made by him, according to you again, is that painting uses natural sign, while poetry uses conventional signs. A natural sign would be simply that something that we don't need any convention to understand, like a flower, for example, but we can come back to that later during the conclusion. So to come back a little bit to the subject of our seminar, how can a painting convey a story if it cannot use temporal signs or elements that follow each other in time? Here I would like to refer to the text we had to read from you, Klaus, that's called Can a Single Still Picture Tell a Story? So you said in the text that if pictures are good at capturing spatial relationship and bad at capturing temporal relationships, he says, Lessing in this case, that we ought to use them for something closer to description than to narrations. And the point of Lessing is not that painting cannot tell story because of any physical law such as gravity, but because of aesthetical law that he wants to establish. So for him, painting is not efficient in telling story. And moreover, he often ends up in an unpleasant work of art. Hence, it is not that painting cannot tell story, but that it should not do it. Throughout this book, Lessing uses the example of a famous sculpture called Laocoon and his sons that you can see on the slide. It's also the title of the book, and this sculpture is quite highly famous, and now you can see it in the Vatican Museum. It is approximately dated around 200 years before Christ. There's some interesting ambiguity for Lessing to use it as an example of the art he's praising for. The sculpture is definitely like fixing a moment, but telling also a snippet of a story. It does fix a moment in time, like Lessing wants to. And as you say, it does not fix the ultimate climax, which could have been the worst case of bad taste for him. So the idea of Lessing is like you have to fix, when you paint or when you sculpt, you fix a specific moment in time. Like, I mean, photography would be a good example nowadays. But he's kind of advocating that we have to fix a specific moment, which is not the climax. So a moment which is transitory, that would leave some room for imagination to the viewer.
Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Can I say some? Are you going to talk about this question of Winkelmann and the pain, or not at all?
No.
Okay, so I'll mention that briefly because it's kind of, for those who don't know the time, this kind of the statue was at the center of a debate in the 18th century that started with Winkelmann, who was the major archaeologist, one of the early archaeologists of the time, introducing the idea that the Greeks were representing what he called edle Einfalt und stille Größe. So something like edel, something like noble grandeur and silent greatness. And he takes this as an example to illustrate it and says, well, actually, a great man, the sort of puzzle that people see in the statue is, why is Laocoon, who's being bitten by a snake and who must feel tremendous suffering, which, as Winkelmann says rightly, is visible in his belly, that's kind of retracted. So you see that he has pain, which is interesting because it shows that pain is not only in the face, but in the body. So he says you can see that he suffers pain, but why is he not screaming? If he was screaming, then his mouth should be wide open. And Winkelmann's solution is to say, well, he was kind of what we would now call stoic. So a great Greek hero, even when he's suffering tremendous pain, does not scream, because heroes don't scream. And Lessing then comes and says, I think this is completely wrong, because if Winkelmann was right, and if it was really about what is being depicted, then we shouldn't see any screaming in books either. If the Greek thought that heroes don't scream, then we wouldn't see heroes scream in books. And then Lessing goes into great length of showing a whole series of books where you can see heroes scream, and where you can see heroes scream in the theater and so on. And for pages, we are told that the heroes were screaming. So he's like, Winkelmann's argument can't be right. And the argument he then makes is summed up, part of it is summed up in what I let him put on this slide, where he says the problem is not in the depicted, but in the way of depicting. In literature, you can have people scream because you don't hear them scream. So you don't like suffer and you don't see them scream. But a scream in sculpture would look ugly. A mouth drawn widely open, as is said in this quote, is an unseemly spot upon the canvas and an ugly hollow in the marble, presenting the most disagreeable effect imaginable. So Lessing still thinks that the aim of the arts is beauty and imitation, but in their imitation, they're limited by the desire to make beautiful stuff. And as an ugly hollow is not beautiful, a sculptor or a painter, as it is, has to reduce the intensity of the feeling. So that's the first part of this argument. The second one is more narrative argument that Aladdin will talk about, because he has like this double-sided argument onto why Laocoon doesn't actually scream, which was the kind of puzzle of the time. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say about the sculpture, because very often the Laocoon comes up in two debates, one about the expression of pain, media specificity, and the other in this kind of question of conveying stories with images or media that function visually. And there's there are books on both of these subjects. So I think it's important that you're just aware that it's part of both of these debates. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem. So yeah, I have the microphone, right? Yeah, no, it's I don't exactly know if he says that exactly, but there's an interesting point. He's going back often to the mouth, and like, as he said, like if the mouth would have been wide open, it would be like really horrible as a piece of art. But he kind of saying that it does, that actually the sculpture fixed the moment just before it shrank in a way, because then it's a transitory moment, but not the climax of it. And then he selects
so that's
this
a
moment.
narrative argument, exactly.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, and then yeah.
No, but yeah, but I didn't want to cut you out. I just wanted to encourage you.
No. Maybe I mixed a bit there about the narrative and the painting.
Okay, the two arguments. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the idea of the idea of the mouth in painting or sculpture comes quite few times in Lessing's text, and it's quite interesting because we kind of draw a sort of conclusion out of that, that even the idea of a painting, of a sculpture could be able to tell a narrative is actually a horrible idea for Lessing. So just checking where I was. Yeah, so I would just like to go now to sort of a conclusion. And I would like to draw attention to a sculpture I recently saw at Tate Modern. Is this big fountain sculpture made by Carol Walker to present in the Turbine Hall. And it's quite interesting because she did the sculpture and using water and the sculpture in order to tell the story of slave trade and fate and tragedy of people from the three continents of Africa, America, and Europe, as she said. And I believe that probably Lessing would have liked this sculpture, but not for the topic itself, but to the aim of trying to tell a story by fixing many different moments, many different transitory moments in order to tell a story without any linear action in a way, but with distorted body in space. So Lessing argued for differentiation of painting and poetry based on his own canon that he wants to establish, basically. So, and according to him, painting should not tell story, not because it cannot, but because it's not its highest aim. And I would like to draw here on a more personal note, because I do admit as an artist and also more as a visual anthropologist, I already felt like certain limitation of certain mediums or media. And it's actually why visual anthropology was founded at the beginning. Indeed, the idea was that anthropologists were like creating like large data set using photography or moving images, and they realized that at some point, some of the footage or some of the images were actually more efficient to tell the story or the studied people than the text himself. And I guess as an artist, something I often encounter as well. And even that's actually the way of turning on its head the idea of Lessing, because he tried to create like rules that could be actually quite interesting if they were not that dogmatic in a way. And maybe we can like start a discussion on this question. And that was the short presentation about him.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's great to bring in this fountain. It would be interesting to see it more in detail. I mean, what I read in the text you put there is that the fountain explores interconnected history of Africa and America and Europe. She uses water as a key theme, referring to the transatlantic slave trade. That's also something Lessing wouldn't have liked, because he was very critical of allegory. So the water here, I would say, somehow comes in allegorically, symbolizing as a metonymy or as a passport toto, the kind of water that was essential to the slave trade. And Lessing thought that the great force of the visual arts was to be immediately understandable, and allegory needs to be decrypted. So it makes sense that this information is given by the Tate Modern, because people would probably just naturalize it as a sculpture otherwise, and they would say, it's not a sculpture, a fountain has water. But here, Kara Walker endows the water in the fountain with a specific meaning related to the slave trade. Maybe we could come, if we saw it more closely, to this conclusion that here the water is actually not as it usually is in a fountain, unmotivated, like meaningless. The water in the fountain doesn't mean anything. It's there for play, and maybe the figures mean something. But here, Kara Walker takes something that usually is not endowed with meaning, or at least specific political meaning, and endows it with a meaning. So she motivates it somehow, where you usually in artworks, of course, have motivated and unmotivated things. For instance, when you have a torso, the absence of legs is not motivated. It wouldn't make sense to say, why is this person legless, right? But maybe the facial traits are motivated. And in a fountain, usually the fact that it spits water wouldn't be motivated in terms of meaning, but here it becomes motivated. But this motivation is one Lessing would maybe have found too complicated. And he thought that as opposed to poetry, and you nicely made this distinction with between these two lists. Poetry or literature, the verbal medium functions symbolically. Lessing calls it artificial signs, whereas visual art functions with natural signs. And natural sign is not so much what you said, a flower, but it's the idea that it's a sign that has a natural relationship with its object. Because a flower in the real world, in the nature, we wouldn't, I mean, it would lead far. Some people would have said that it's kind of, it shows God's plan and so on. So it would also be representational, but in the most common way, we wouldn't see it as being representational. But natural signs, a typical natural sign that's used since antiquity as an example is smoke as a sign for fire, right? Because there's a causal natural relationship.
So you mean it's a bit the idea of the index for
yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, exactly. So the index would be a development of the natural sign, and the icon is also a natural sign, however. So what's interesting about Peirce is not so much a distinction between the symbol on the one hand, and on the other hand, the index and the icon, but the fact that he makes a distinction in the realm of natural signs, because the distinction between natural and artificial signs exists at least since Plato, where he says, where he makes already this difference between both. But usually a sign like smoke was treated on a par with a sign, with a pictorial sign. And the pictorial sign, what's its natural relationship to the object? Its resemblance. I mean, that's sort of the classical idea. It resembles somehow the object, whereas a word doesn't resemble its objects. Apart from certain kinds of words, which are then iconic in Peirce's sense, which are the onomatopoeia. Okay. When we say a vowel, then the sound resembles the sound made by it. And by the way, brand names like Swiffer also have an onomatopoetic element. So they're somehow iconic in the sense of resembling the sound that's being emitted, in this case, when you clean something and so on. So yeah, so that's this difference. And Peirce makes this interesting supplementary difference between icon and index. And of course, smoke doesn't resemble fire. So it makes sense, but it is causally connected to fire. And many icons, many images that resemble their object don't have a causal connection to the object, at least not a strict immediate one, because I can draw a picture of something that I don't see, or of a kind of thing that I've never seen. There doesn't have to be a causation for something to resemble. And by the way, sometimes we make pictures that resemble an object that we didn't want it to resemble to. So there was no causal connection initially to the object that they resemble, and yet they're icons of that object, right? As when people inadvertently, I once in a class wanted to draw a car, and I drew this like big thing in the middle and then two things on the side that I wanted to be the wheels, and it came to look like a penis. And everyone started laughing, and I didn't know why. But obviously it was an icon that was not intentional and that was not connected, at least not in a way that I'm conscious of, to any penis. But it still looked like one. So it was still a natural sign of a penis resembling. And then, of course, there are refinements in picture theory that say, well, resemblance is not really resemblance as in objective resemblance, because, and that's an argument made by Nelson Goodman, any a picture on a paper resembles other pictures on papers more than the objects they depict. A picture of a house resembles other pictures of houses more than the house that's being depicted. So the solution that's generally brought in is to subjectivize resemblance, or to operate with recognition rather than resemblance, and say what counts is that we recognize a certain house in the picture. Maybe it's on paper and the house is in bricks, the house is spatial, the picture is not, and so on. So objectively, there are many dissociations between both, but still subjectively, we can have a feeling of recognizing a specific house or kind of house in a picture. So the resemblance is then kind of subjectivized, and this solves a lot of the problems with an objective resemblance theory, which people like Plato maybe still held. One last point, because it's the second important, the narrative argument. If you can come back to the sculpture maybe on your slideshow, to the Lessings, to the Laocoon, yeah. So the first argument we saw is like kind of about beauty. And there's a second media specificity argument where, as you well mentioned, Lessing thinks you should always not show the climax. And he says the climax in this case would be Laocoon shrieking or crying out loudly, as in Maximum Pain. But Lessing thinks that if you show this climax, maybe you remember what he says about like why you shouldn't show the climax?
Yeah, I mean, it also say like, then, I mean, I think it say two things that I remember is like, first that if you show something like the climax, the more you see it, the less you will be detached to it. So if you, the first time maybe you will be like kind of struck by it, and then the more you look at it, then the less you be distanced. They also say like, yeah, if you do show the climax, you don't leave any like imagination rooms for the viewer to expand to before and after, because it's basically there's no other things happening. I mean, I don't know if it's clear, but
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting part, as I think, of the argument, that he thinks that you should always show the before or the after. So when you show, for instance, he takes the instance of Medusa, it's better to show her when she's still pondering to do something terrible, like eating her children in order to punish her husband, or killing her children, or just after, because then we will imagine in our personal way what happened. And our personal imagination will always be stronger than anything an artist could show. That's at least Lessing's point. So he says, if you show the maximum, you tie the wings of the imagination, and people won't imagine anything beyond, because you're already at the maximum level. So there's no more space for imagination to roam. And that's an argument which I've always found very, very interesting and intriguing. And when you think of some horror movies like Blair Witch Project that function admirably well, they function because they never show the monster, because then the monster is our monster, as in our head, and each of us can have their individual monsters fill in the actual screen monster. And that's why there are also these memes of when the monster finally appears in horror films. Many times, actually, it's rather laughable, or people are disappointed. So in a certain sense, I think Lessing can make a case as well for a certain way of dealing with horror films, for instance. And then there's this more technical argument, of course, where he says the ideal moment, and that's a term that's important for the theory. The ideal moment is the moment that lets you imagine the before and after. So there's this question of intensity of imagination, but then there's also the question of the narrative, this timeline that runs. I talked about a double timeline at one point earlier. So the timeline of the narrative. And he says, well, when you see him only sigh, you can imagine the moment where he was still free, and you can imagine the moment where he will already be dead. So when you choose the intermediary moment, and Lessing calls it the pregnant moment, it's a term that he coins and that you'll read maybe in some of the literature. Fruchtbare Moment, fruitful, we could also translate it. The fruchtbare Moment is the moment that makes you imagine the before and the after. And of course, the fruitful moment is the solution to the problem of representing time in an image. When you say polychrony is not for us anymore, we don't believe that an image should show several moments explicitly, like the ones I showed before with Witz, when you think that this is overcome, then the question is, okay, but how do I convey a story? And Lessing says, well, by making people imagine the story based on choosing the right moment that will make people fill in the blanks spontaneously. And this right moment he calls the pregnant moment, which in a famous essay is then criticized by Gombrich, because Gombrich says there is no pregnant moment. Every moment already contains the moment before and the moment after. But I think he's kind of begging the question, because in Lessing, the pregnant moment is not an actual moment of a course of events, but it's a reconstructed moment, a moment that maybe never existed. And so in the notes for the Laocoon, he will also say that you will never blame an artist for going beyond one moment. For instance, in some paintings of Raphael, I think he says, you still see the cloth in one position and the foot already in another. And another way, and then there's a last interpretation, and then maybe I'll stop with this, but I think it's such a fundamental argument that I really want you to know about it. And it's really inspiring to, I mean, for me, it was really inspiring to read Lessing. Another argument that comes a bit later is made by Goethe. Goethe is kind of the guy who gives the final, like who also wants to have his say and a final word about the Laocoon. And Goethe says, actually, you have a distributed, what I call distributed narration, where you have one son who's already lost, the one on the left, because the snakes have totally already enrolled him. There's Laocoon, who seemed to be able to get free, but is now being bitten, so probably he can't escape. And then there's the son to the right, where the snake has only her body around his one foot and the arm, and where you still have the feeling that he can be saved. So the sculpture kind of distributes the temporalities, where the sun that we now see to our right is the beginning of the story. Then you have the middle, and then the end of like no escape and death. So that would be another, it's kind of a bit of a different device, because Lessing concentrates his whole analysis on the father who's in the middle. By the way, this story, of course, from Greek antiquity, from the story of the Trojan horse, because Laocoon is a priest who says, I don't take in the horse. I'm afraid of the Greek, even when they leave gifts, is a famous sentence that's being coined by drama then about this. So he says, don't take it in. And then a snake comes out of the sea, sent by a goddess, and kills him and his two sons for saying that. And then the Trojans think, oh, the gods are for us to take in the horse. But the thing is that the goddess was supporting the Greeks. So she didn't want any warning to be heard, and that's why she sent the snakes, and they end up killing all of them. But in any case, that's kind of the story. And then you have like this whole distributed narrative. So Lessing focuses on the son, but Goethe says, no, actually we can take into account all actors. And the time is not only in this pregnant moment in Laocoon himself, with his mouth slightly opened and not fully, but also in the sons. Yeah, that's kind of it. And the point of departure, I see that like I have to stop myself, but I want to give you the full argument. Still, the point of departure is this difference that you made, that you pointed out, Aladdin, between a second difference. So you have natural science in visual art versus conventional science in poetry. But then there's the second difference as well, which is the progressive nature of poetry, temporal nature, and the spatial nature, simultaneous nature of pictures. So that's the second difference. These are two semiotic differences. And Lessing initially says, you can't really use spatial science to depict things that are successive, that run in time. So he makes this kind of association, and that's something that a lot of people have embraced and still embrace until like you regularly see essays come out where people say, well, as Lessing has already shown, you can't literally depict anything temporal in a spatial medium. Actually, this idea is kind of a weird idea when you think about it, because he says there's a semiotic structure, there's what we would call a syntactic structure. So signs are ordered near to one another, and this syntactic structure somehow is suitable for a certain syntactic structure in the world, which is the syntax of bodies besides each other. So it kind of presupposes the idea that there's a syntax in the world, where on the one hand, there would be things that follow each other in time. And for this, you would need signs that also follow each other in order to kind of depict the temporal structure in the world, or there are things that are next to each other, just bodies in a moment, and that you can depict with media that are also spatial. And then the solution is the pregnant moment, because the pregnant moment, as you see, is actually a way to use a spatial medium and still depict time, because the time will come in through your mind, because you'll imagine the other moments. So you stick to the spatiality of your medium, but you can still convey temporality. And yeah, so you have one aspect which is a strictly semiotic kind of Lessing with these differences between sign systems, and then you have a reception theorist Lessing, and so he gives the solution to his own to the problem he poses before, and says, well, on paper, on the screen, or in sculpture, you can't have the moments, but you can convey them, you can evoke them, and then the viewer will bring them in anyway. Yeah, Jesse was making. You said Derrida, what up? Can you explain what you want to say about Derrida?
I just meant yeah. I just meant exactly what you were saying. I mean that even though you may act as if signs kind of like can't stand for themselves or whatever, they're like always dependent on like inherent sequences and their interplay and the differences that are then set up. Since I'm on now, I'm just gonna say something else as well. I really like that Aladdin chose the William Blake image of Laocoon at the start, because this entire concept really reminds me of W.J.T. Mitchell, who I read once, who has this whole notion of the meta picture, so a picture that is inherently self-referential and breaks with the difference between visual, or it breaks with the difference of painting and poetry, which I think makes a lot of sense. And William Blake plays a big role in the way he lays that out, so that there's not, I mean, it's pretty obvious from our vantage point, I think, that there's not this neat break between the two, kind of, or that it's even desirable. And especially if we consider now also in terms of the temporal and space, if we consider AR or VR or movie storytelling, or perhaps also some notions of theater and things like that. But I kind of wanted to say something why I think that's not desirable, because Lessing said it's desirable, and it doesn't, I mean, it's another German bringing up a dichotomy kind of that that makes a lot of sense, that in the end then I don't know, the Nazis were so interested in art, kind of, to me, because kind of what I found, and I mean, it's hindsight, obviously, but what Aladdin also said in terms of the dogmatic, and that he seeks to establish his own canon, kind of, it kind of just doesn't work, I think, because, or it doesn't work in the sense of, well, it's a very static kind of notion, because then you're only ever looking for, and now I'm thinking of Jacques Rancière, then you're only ever working on the basis of having a consensus, for example, things that are beautiful or not beautiful. So then you only ever talk about the same bodies or identities or practices in the world that aren't challengeable, because you're not allowed under the consensus to represent them in painting or poetry, like whether or not you decide for one side of the split or the other. So I think it's not problematic, because I mean, it doesn't really hold up, but just that it doesn't really hold up, I think, in terms, if we want to talk about also how narratives in terms of the other texts are very real things that determine how people live their lives and the kind of values that we share.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the idea that like art has to be beautiful, I mean, I think is pretty much long overcome, even though I personally have the feeling that it has the right to be beautiful again. You know, like how people usually say that this idea of criticizing beauty, or like that ugliness can be a relevant aesthetic feeling in art, that it was kind of brought in by Goya after the Napoleonic Wars, where you had all these horrible events happening, and then he kind of made things, wanted to show the world as it is with all its brutality, and then created the first kind of ugly artworks, even though there's also examples from antiquity with a guy that was called a hopograph, a shit painter, basically, because he painted like low life already. But sort of in modernity, we usually have that start with Goya, and then of course, after the war, after First World War, a lot of people become critical of the idea that the artist should be like creating a beautiful illusion for the bourgeois, like make the bourgeois think that like life is actually cool where it's not, and that the world is nice where it's not. And so people like Roche, of course, or Otto Dix wanted to like violently paint the ugliness of the world. But for me, paradoxically, with conceptual art, suddenly, with conceptual art, it's not about aesthetics at all. It makes aesthetics available again as something of a quality where you can make beautiful things, because what the artist is about is not the aesthetic form anyway. So then the aesthetic form can also be pleasing just as well as non-pleasing. So that's one reason I think why beauty is not a problem, doesn't seem to be a problem for many artists anymore, where it was such a problem still for Dieter Roth and a lot of people who said, as soon as I make something beautiful, I stop because I don't want that, and so on. But since in our century, or in our decade, I have a feeling that beauty is totally back, and that's totally legitimate, that artists feel that it's legitimate to make beautiful artworks. And another reason might also be that, of course, people like Goya and Grosch still felt the need to represent a reality that was repressed by public discourse, and that wasn't available. You didn't have beheadings on YouTube at the time. You didn't have it on CNN and so on and so forth. And so the artists saw their role as making this view of the world available. But now, as all these views of the world are available, artists are again looking for more indirect, maybe more strategies to grapple with this aspect of the world. So I don't know, like very often looking at the aftermath of the event, or Lamia Jorege in her Objects of War about the war in Beirut will ask people what objects were relevant to them in the war, and then she'd show these objects and do interviews with the people, because the images of the war are already present. Maybe that's like some reasons. But yeah, so this question of the beautiful, of course, is kind of essential for Lessing's theory, because it motivates part of it. But then I think he also has a very successful theory, or at least worthy of discussion, of how to create something that comes close to an illusion, or to make natural science as natural as possible. And along these lines, I think it's not a coincidence that the trompe-l'œil, the image that kind of tries to make it seem like the things are actual there that are being depicted, is still life, and it's not a narrative scene, because if it's a scene with people, it would be moving. So Lessing might actually be right about the fact that if you depict states, you have better chance of the viewer confounding, or of having strong imitation because confusion is rare. Yeah. So maybe it's not a successful theory of art, probably not, but it might still be an interesting theory of mimesis, or what makes for successful mimesis. And yeah, and it's true that that Mitchell wrote about Lessing. It's even one of the chapters of his books, or several times he comes back to Lessing and criticizes this distinction between the arts of time and the arts of space. But I think he's wrong to think that Lessing is totally normative. It's just that the presuppositions that Lessing had, that art needs to be beautiful and art needs to create illusion, are not presuppositions we hold anymore. But if you make these presuppositions, his theory actually is a descriptive theory. So it's kind of, if you want to make illusion, if you want to create illusions that are beautiful in a sense, maybe of the 18th century, but beautiful, then follow these rules. So yeah. But maybe these are more technical questions that are less of concern for us. Other points, Aladdin, anything that came to your mind as we were discussing, or someone else who wants to chime in on these theories from the 18th century? Do you see something that's still relevant in there? Kid, for instance, is there like something where you would say it still connects to contemporary artist preoccupations, or Aladdin, did you find something that was?
I don't know. I guess I would say the same about, and I said this about Nelson Goodman in another seminar, but the way I feel about Lessing is he's probably an asshole that I wouldn't have much to talk to about. You know, you know, it's interesting that music was completely absent, you know, in the binarification, I guess, of art, because it doesn't fit squarely easily within those confines, I think. But yeah, I don't know that I have anything really meaningful to add other than that.
No, I think music would have been it's usually considered an art of time. I mean, it's like the purest art of time usually, to the point where some people even try to conceptualize music in virtue of its temporality. Other comments? Anything? Okay. No, I don't see any comments. Okay. Yeah, Ellen? Yeah.
It was already I unmuted. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was already reiterated, but just the sense of when we spoke about talking about if you show the maximum, then there's no room left for anything to develop. And I think that's still very much the case in a lot of like contemporary art. Like, how much do you reveal? How, especially then in terms of, you know, do you supply information to the visitor, or do you just leave it as a title and the artwork, and then the name of the artist or something? And then if that's the case, you know, how much message does the artist want to get across? And then how much do you leave for the imagination? And I think that kind of is always a difficult game to play a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Any comments on that? I mean, this question of the degree of explicitness, I think you're totally right that it's a key question, and yeah, how much do you provide in the paratexts around the work, and how much can you actually make comprehensible through the work? Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to when you first started talking earlier about themes, or about like a more basic story, and then having that basic story be something everybody knows. So then you can kind of build off of that or work off of that. And that strikes me as something that's maybe, there's always a kind of, I wonder if we could figure out any piece of any narrative that doesn't have another narrative as a frame of reference for it, or at least some kind of narrative framework or infrastructure that underlies, you know, any piece of art, whether it be polychronic, diachronic, whatever. Seems like a infrastructural kind of like narratives that we all feel in the middle of, you know, have tension, that we are in, are always going to form a like a theme that we can all assume the author has. But I was also thinking about that in relationship to like musical narratives, because of course we need a kind of lens to hear most music, and the lens is like the scale, the key signature. And once you have that, for that basic narrative structure of just like do, 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 dee, da, 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 then you've got home, away from home, back to home, maybe some tension, and that's just that basic narrative structure. And then you can put, you know, diachronic, polychronic, whatever. You can tell stories that are not that same story, but everybody has in their mind that same basic story, or maybe basic chord progressions. And then there's kind of like, yeah, so anyhow, I was thinking that that relates because, oh, and obviously what I mainly want to say was like with like jazz, for instance, where you have like a theme established, and then other musicians can, and first the theme gets established, and then everybody has to have that theme, you know, that narrative, that story that gets told, you know, that musical story that gets told, and then everybody else after it's established can do things that vary on that, and it can get really, 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 you know, far from the original theme, but everybody in their head, they're thinking, oh, everything is perceived as a variation of the original theme and not just some standalone different piece. And it wouldn't make any sense, you know, most of those variations wouldn't make any sense without having that original frame established. So it was just my thoughts as you were talking earlier.
Nice, yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's really, I mean, it somehow ties back to what we saw last time when we were talking about the idea that stories are read through other stories. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that there would be like common story threads. That's the first remark you made. And then the second remark is even a bit different about like themes in music. There's even there's a special number of the Journal of Narratology from the French-speaking countries on music and the problem of narrative in music, because of course it's highly debated, because music doesn't have a double time structure. For instance, you don't have like the time of the told and time of the telling. You kind of have this one structure that runs through, and you need that. Can there be an intrigue, a plot in music? And you're suggesting that somehow there can, and I think we intuitively sometimes feel that there is a plot. There are things that are fought, the different voices.
Well, you always have some kind of keynote. You always have a home, and then you leave, and then there's tension, and there's climax, and then there's resolution. So there's a basic narrative structure to all music. Mm-hmm. And one thing that's interesting, if anybody's interested in following this thread further, in regards to narrative in music, is the Schenkerian analysis, which was a person that was basically just describing in trying to like create an analysis of narrative in music. And they talk about two different spaces or dimensions of resonance. And that relates to a lot of things that we're talking about here. So you have like chord structure, or you have like a chord, which has like notes being played in the same beat. And those are resonating with each other, and they create a chord. There's a relationship between them. Not really so much a story, but you've got resonance. But then with Schenkerian analysis, they show how when you're playing things in sequence, you know, before and after each other, that there's still resonance between those as well. So you kind of create one dimension of complexity going, you know, notes stacked on top of each other that are resonating with each other. And then you have resonance for the notes before and after each other, which of course is going to depend on whether the viewer has an attention span where they're still kind of remembering and recalling the things that came before it. But anyhow.
Amazing. Yeah, that's totally, yeah, it's similar to the idea where you would have a painting that is a sequence, and then within each painting you would again have things that are co-present at the same time, and how these two structures relate to each other. I mean, maybe that doesn't make much sense to push the analogy further, but yeah, to this point it would work. Tying back to this idea of the stories, we read stories through. One art historian from France, Anne Meuglin-Delcroix, wrote about that at one point, where she said, well, at the time of traditional Renaissance painting, all the viewers kind of shared the same stories, all the intended viewers at least. So they all knew the Bible, they all knew the mythological stories those paintings were addressing. But she thinks that today the stories have become individual. So her like take on that is that like artists now, that people don't share the same stories anymore that much. And so an artist will usually have their personal story, and if you want to understand the artwork, and many times you will need to know that story that is individualized. And so the story needs to be told, which is one way to motivate as well that the power text has become so important, because of course not everybody can know everybody's story, so you need to convey the story. And her idea is that because we don't have this much of a shared cultural foundation anymore. But then, and that maybe is why artists are very often jump on things like Trump, and they become such a theme, because suddenly you have a figure that seems to be shared again. Like everybody has has an idea on them, and then you can suddenly come back to this fundament and work off that.
It might also relate to certain kinds of narrative imbued products like Coca-Cola or any kind of like enriched goods, because there's stories that we can all share because they've been advertised to all of us. So we all know these basic histories and stories and culture around these sort of artifacts.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, maybe unfortunately these could be the shared stories still, the advertisements, kind of what we know about products, which might also again explain why they have been so present since pop art, because they are again like a common fundament. So if you want to communicate something, you can rely on these kind of things. And when Warhol first chose the Campbell's soup can, it was just because Campbell's soup was the most popular soup in America. It wasn't like for some deep reason, metaphysical reason, but it was like the one thing that most people would know. So yeah, sure, there's these stories and pop and maybe pop culture. Things like Harry Potter would probably be widely shared. Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones figures, this kind of stuff could have replaced. Yeah. Are there other remarks? Could have replaced mythology or religion as like a common knowledge base. Okay, we also should move to the second presentation. Actually, there was a response by Andrew to Aladdin that I didn't quite explicitly ask for. Andrew, did you wanna? Now that we've had the whole Lessing debate, did you want to say something? Oops.
I don't have a lot to add, to be honest. Don't have too much to add. Yeah, let's see. No, to be honest, I don't have too much to add. One thing that was interesting to me that we haven't perhaps touched on too much was this idea that, so it says something here about the poet not being obliged to concentrate his subject into a single moment, and that Virgil's Laocoon screams, but we cannot in the moment of his agony forget that he is the same individual who has already won our admiration and love. So I don't know, I haven't really formulated what I'm trying to say here yet, but I guess I'm trying to frame that in the context of, well, firstly, the idea of the pregnant moment and the fact that in that instance, there is this kind of, you are connecting the dots, let's say, or you are developing an understanding of what you're seeing that is temporal, as you're saying, it fixes that problem. So yeah, I guess another question is like, well, how is it true that a picture can't have these, you know, the Laocoon shown in a sculpture doesn't have connotations coming with it, and thereby you do have an understanding of him that isn't just reliant on that single image, or you know, another way of putting it is like, I mean, this starts to get away from what you actually gaining from the work of art itself, but you know, I mean, yeah, I guess basically the point is that any work of art has around it a context that we're effectively never entirely separate from, and it's well, I guess it's therefore impossible that you could say, oh well, the Laocoon in the sculpture, you know, we wouldn't trust him, you know, if he was to show his pain or la la la, then we wouldn't trust him, whereas in the poem
since we have an understanding of him that develops over time, then it's a more mediated image, or not mediate, but more, there's more balance in how that person's perceived. And
it's interesting. I mean, do you think this context, like to be around, or that you can have in the work already, like that you receive the work with context, even though this context is not given in the work, or that you like
yes,
will contextualize?
For sure, but I mean, I guess there are certain things that that do require, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a reasonable example, but for example, Duchamp's toilet, if you have no conception of what a urinal is, then you don't, your access to the meaning of that artwork isn't possible from the artwork itself. So yeah, in a lot of cases, I don't know. Yeah, so that's just to say that maybe the context is not always inherent to the artwork.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Totally. I mean, Fountain wouldn't be a narrative work, but it somehow, I think Fountain ties in perfectly with the enrichment question, because it lives on, it thrives on the narrative about it. If you don't know the story of Duchamp submitting it and it being refused in this open exhibition where normally everybody was accepted, and all these kind of if this whole story, actually the work exists through a story, it's not the actual object. And I think that's a fundamental shift in conceptual art, and that's widely unacknowledged, because conceptual art is supposed to be about concept and discourse, not about stories. And there's even an anti-story aspect to it, but the way it lives and circulates is through the stories. So there's this kind of rejection of storytelling in modernity that Mitchell talks about at length in an unpublished book. But on the other hand, a lot of it lives on the stories. Beuys couldn't exist without the stories he told about his plane crash with the Tartars putting felt around him and helping him get well again and all that, which was probably an invented story, but it becomes constitutive of his whole identity as an artist. And somehow this is maybe an early version of what you were saying, Jesse, about the micro narratives that each person builds, because artists have already used this device to position themselves as artists, from Duchamp through Beuys to Yves Klein with judo and Zen and Zen in John Cage and so on. I mean, a lot of what we believe about these artists is actually conveyed through the stories they built around their own life and persona. Something else in terms of how, which somehow seems similar to what you said about literature, is that there's a few texts by Eisenstein, the film director, who wrote a lot, where he speaks of something he calls cinematism or something, and he says that they're precursors of cinema in montage, insofar as montage already exists in traditional artworks, and the Laocoon would be a great example, in the sense where the belly has it expresses one thing, the face another. So you can actually have something like a montage that's in one figure. And in my thesis, I kind of argued that there was an equivalent of the Kulichev effect. I think someone mentioned it earlier. The Kulichev effect, where you show a face that's rather expressionless of a man, and then you show a woman that's half naked, and you'll have the feeling that he's smiling, kind of a dirty old smile, as Hitchcock says in his version, when he says that it's a dirty old man when you see his face related to a woman in a bikini. Hitchcock redid the Khrushchev effect in one of his shows. And then you see food, and then you have a feeling that the same face, the exact same face, expresses desire for the food, expresses hunger. And then you show a funeral, and you have the feeling that this exact same face expresses sadness. And this is called the Khrushchev effect, this kind of combination in montage. It's apparently hard to reproduce in psychology, so anyway, but it's at least it's part of common mythology that it exists. And I would hold that it can also exist in one moment artworks, because depending on how, even if you only have one figure, how different body parts look, you will interpret differently the expression of the face, for instance, or so there is something that's similar to the literature, or what you said about literature, or what Lessing says about literature, where you can have the hero at several moments, also in artworks, and even in a simple drawing, you can have something like that, sort of montage effect. I want to, because I want to show you this work, which I find a great example of that. You see this drawing by Oskar Kokoschka, and if you only look at the face, you kind of see a calm kind of person, but then the hands have this, like, they're highly in movement. They have this artificial movement, and I really have the feeling that Kokoschka somehow performed a montage here, where it's a portrait of Klaus, Viennese writer, beginning of the century, wrote and published a journal called The Torch, which is Die Fackel in German. It's very interesting guy, died in 1936, and in Klaus, his public persona is this very violent satirist, but his private, like, when you read his letters, you realize that he's, like, actually highly sensitive and easily swayed, or not swayed, because he doesn't change his opinions easily, but moved by even small events. And arguably you have both parts of his person in this drawing, which is something that at least Karl Kraus thought, and I still tend to agree with him. Photography can hardly do, unless you cut it up and do something like Hockney in his photographic experiments, where he reproduced a walk through a garden by using different photographs and putting them together in a montage way. But in drawing, you can, of course, naturally create a montage by showing different parts of the body in different moments. And there's even a remark in Merleau-Ponty, L'œil et l'esprit. What is that? The spirit or the mind and the eye, where he says, why do the horses in Jericho seem to run? And he says, it's not because the horse has a realistic position. No actual horse was ever in this position, but they have one leg in each instant. So actually the illusion of movement would come through the fact that different parts of the painting of one horse are in different moments. And somehow I would say, arguably, that this is something that's true in the drawing by Kokoschka of Karl Kraus as well. And that if you don't see the disconnect that strongly unless you hide one of the two parts of the body. When you hide the hands, you kind of see this very strong calm. But when you hide the face, you kind of expect a much more movemented face, and it's easy to think that there's more movement in the face than there actually is when you read the face through the hands, which would be then the equivalent to the Khrushchev effect, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that's for this montage thing. And another interesting reference in relationship to the things through which we read stories is Butor's Les mots et les images. Michel Butor, who's this experimental nouveau roman writer, who wrote a book about words and images. And he says even the most recent production is always embedded in words. We can't receive anything without already having words around it. So we actually always read even the newest artworks through a host of discourse. So it would be somewhat illusory to think that like the artwork exists as a cosmos in itself, and kind of a probably wrong romantic idea. Okay. If there are no other points right now.
Just
Yes.
add one more thing.
Yes.
On the Laocoon. It's maybe a question, to be honest.
Yeah.
To you, and it was just it's not a paradox, but the idea that you mentioned, Klaus, of placing focus on artwork being understandable immediately, in a sense, that sort of stands somewhat in opposition to this idea that he has of leaving room for the imagination, right? Or, I mean, it makes sense because you leave room for the imagination so that someone can, or the viewer can fill in the story according to their own, can put their own view into the story. But then the fact that it need be immediately understandable makes it sound as though it's only applicable to sort of existing stories, or I mean, that seems almost, I'm not sure how to reconcile that, and how he would, whether that's like a conservative view or something, to say that, well, the artwork you must understand the story of the artwork straight away, but there must also be room so that you can embellish that story according to your own imaginative capacities. So, but yeah, I mean, that's what it sounds like, but that would mean, I don't understand then how a new story would come into that, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that the imagination, as Lessing conceives of it here, is like something that's rather automatic. So he would like say that it's not like you have something and then you actively like go into imagination mode. It's more something that's triggered. He thinks of it as like something that would be naturally triggered by certain depictions, where others would be less prone to triggering it because they're showing too much. So in that sense, maybe it's not totally incompatible with this idea of immediate understandability, but this, maybe I wasn't quite precise enough when I called it immediately understandable. It was more the idea that it's understandable without like having recourse to further knowledge. And he thinks that visual art can be more intense because it doesn't need you to intellectualize it. I mean, that's kind of his stance. And whereas words, you need to have learned the words, and then you're already very close to symbolization. I mean, words in itself are symbols in themselves, are symbols in the sense Peirce gives to the term, because they're conventionalized and they are, as Peirce says, understood in virtue of habit, fictitious habits. So we are used to using words in a certain way, and then we decrypt them. So he thinks that like conventional signs already have this mediation through reason, and that's why it's no problem to use them to depict like more abstract states. But images can have the potential to be like, to have this intensity and to not have to go through intellectual activity in a sense of reasoning, and therefore they should, we should stick to, like, we shouldn't fill it up with like symbols and allegories and like bring in the intellect again. Kind of that's at least his idea about it. You kind of give away what's the interesting potential. And interestingly, at one point he will say, and by the way, what I've said only counts for artworks. If you use images to convey information or to teach, it's a different story. Then you can do whatever you want. But if you want them to be as beautiful as possible and to evoke illusions, which artworks should do according to Lessing, then please kind of refrain from symbols, because if you don't know the meaning of them, it will remain obscure, or you will have to like intellectually reconstruct what this interaction of two women means, in order to figure out that one is Justice and other is Clemens, and that Clemens is asking Justice to be less strict or something, where you have to bring in all these concepts and you need to decrypt the balance that's lying on the floor. So Justice is not actually being active, and so on and so forth. And the sword is not being used, not upheld. And it becomes this whole intellectual operation, which he says in art should not be there. I mean, after 19th and 20th century, will probably not agree with this point of view. But it might still be true that if you're after an immediate effect, then the less intellectual it is, the better your chances to have this immediate effect, right? Okay, let's move to Peter Huhn, who is a very contemporary. So there are only like 2 texts in this debate that I put up. I guess because I find Peter Huhn kind of a contemporary take on, or it's like a contemporary take to this age-old problem of depicting stories in images, and that's also nearly the title of the paper, which Susie will introduce us to.
Okay, yeah. So the text is called Visual Narratives, Narration in Paintings and Photographs. And Huhn basically argues that a narrative picture, such as narrative painting or photograph, cannot be said to narrate a story strictly. So he lays out a few arguments why not, and gives us a few ways to think about that. And a lot of it sort of has to do with a kind of level of explicitness with relation to the elements that constitute a story. So if essentially a story needs to have a temporal dimension, the succession of happenings over time with some kind of causal coherence, there also needs to be some mental interiority on the part of the protagonists. And there needs to be some kind of meaningful change of state. So the internal dimension on the part of the protagonist here is important, because that contains either the causes for or the reactions to this change of state. And this is essentially what forms the meaning of the story. Or another way to say that maybe is that the meaning of the story ultimately rests on its eventfulness. So the occurrence of an unexpected turn or a decisive and significant change of state. So Huhn claims that to qualify as narrative, a picture has to display special signals which are meant to induce the viewer to read it narratively and thus construct a story in their own mind. Depending on the nature and explicitness of such signals, one can distinguish degrees of narrativity. So that's to say that a picture can have a high degree of narrativity or low or weak degree of narrativity. And here he refers to Lessing and talks about how pictures tend to rely on this idea of the pregnant moment or the decisive moment, which is the moment in the story which is sort of suggestive enough to allow the viewers or give the viewer tools to infer what came before and what came after. But his point still is that the narrative can only ever be suggested and not explicit. So in order for the viewer to do this work of using the elements in the picture in this pregnant moment to either extend backwards in time or forwards in time, the viewer needs to draw on what Huhn calls their world knowledge. So this maybe is another way of saying the stories that we read stories through, right? So in his formulation, world knowledge includes literature and the arts, mythology, and stories like the Bible, and consists of what he defines as either frames or scripts, frames being thematic or situational contexts and scripts being established procedures or sequences. And then he further distinguishes between world knowledge into sort of general knowledge, which refers to common human patterns of experience, behavior, and activity, and specified knowledge, which is culturally, socially, and historically specific. So he then goes on to, he applies a kind of narratological reading to 3 pictures, right? A photograph by Cartier-Bresson and 2 paintings, one from the Middle Ages and one from the Renaissance period. And based on that analysis, which I'm not going to get into because we don't have very much time, he distinguishes 2 kind of possible narrative modes that we can define these kind of single pictures into. So one of them is autonomous narration, which he uses the Cartier-Bresson photograph to exemplify. And this is one in which the scene constitutes an event or an eventful change, so this pregnant moment. But what happened before or what will happen after can only be inferred. And so the viewer needs to have some general and some specific knowledge to help fill in the blanks. But they don't need to know exactly what the story is. So in fact, it tells a new story, but you need to have some kind of knowledge of the context. And in the case of this photograph, the frame that he refers to is offered by the caption, which sort of places the image in a certain time. And then the other mode is what he calls the illustrative narration. And these 2 history paintings represent this. And in this mode, a very specific knowledge is presupposed. So the viewer needs to have prior acquaintance with the story. So this is what, Klaus, you were talking about earlier. So they essentially need to have a script on the basis of which they can understand the picture then, either as a reproduction or an illustration of that story, or as something that is trying to sort of retell that story, a retelling or a shifting of the eventfulness in Hun's formulation. But what they both share is the common use of the eventful moment, and which is, this moment that represents the turning point in the story and from which the meaning is derived. So that's a very quick sum up of his arguments there. But the world knowledges question, I think we've just been discussing, and how maybe that idea of world knowledges is kind of like exploding at the moment with these millions of stories constantly told, and this history painting, this narrativity through history painting and documentary photography, especially in the 20th century, perhaps we could think of as a kind of process of training the viewer to read narratives, read images in a narrative way, which we all seem to be very adept at these days, especially with when you think about references to things like Coca-Cola or advertising or marketing relies on a certain high degree of literacy in reading images or reading narrative into images. I think that sort of feeds into some of these conversations we were just having about world knowledges. Don't know if anybody has anything.
I was assigned to respond, so I can respond a little bit. I think the interesting part for me about this and most of and a lot of these going back to Lessing as well is that it seems like there's kind of a little bit of a circular logic going on, whereas there's this expectation of let's see how to explain this. There's this analysis of the image where the expectation for understanding the narrative behind an image is partially left to the observer, or as expected of the observer based upon their what we're calling world knowledge. But I think the reality of it is that there is also, if you take into account that, with the exception possibly of a pure photograph, right, or of an incidental photograph as opposed to maybe a staged photograph, right? So especially when you're talking about art and you're dealing with an artist who's creating an image for a certain purpose, the the artist is also obviously also taking into account the common world knowledge, or the most common world knowledge, in order to incorporate these signs and symbols within the artwork in order to communicate most productively or completely the idea or the narrative they wish to display, right? So it's kind of like and I think maybe this is part of the problem that I have with Lessing and people like Lessing, who like to try to apply rules to artwork, is that the reality of it is that, and it's kind of like you were saying earlier about how the artwork, the grand art of today isn't as it was hundreds of years ago. Now it's the things we talk about are the shared common world knowledge. It's Star Wars and Harry Potter, right? It's not the Greek gods or even religion for the most part. And so I think this it just seems to me that there's a flaw or an unnecessary circularity in the logic that kind of tries to control or filter artwork based upon the specific upon the reliance of rules, right, on how things should be done in order to do a certain thing. Because at the end of the day, both the artist or the creator of the image and the observer of an image are both going to be determining a narrative based upon their own world knowledge. And there's only at best an assumption that there's enough overlap in that world knowledge that the narrative or the meaning is going to come across. So I don't know if I talk myself out of meaning something, but that's kind of what my thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think also part of what we're seeing happening in contemporary art at the moment is you taking that condition that you describe and sort of productively directing it towards highlighting other kinds of world knowledges, right? Or knowledges that where there is not an assumption on the part of the artist that the viewer is going to have some overlap, and that is precisely the point, is to open up into these other kind of visions or other knowledges. So it's a restrictive frame, but I think we're seeing right now at least some artists grappling with how to use that productively, perhaps, or work against it productively.
I think that's pretty interesting, the idea that the artist is not like trying to play to the narrative frames that people have, but is doing things specifically to narrative frames that people do not have in order to help us all develop new frames of reference and things like that, and bring attention to other places. I feel like that brings this dialogue forward.
I think also that's really something that's very much present in design at the moment, because for a lot of reasons, specifically technological reasons, a lot of what happens in design deals with and there's huge methodological changes to that as well, in terms of design as a craft, if you follow that split kind of. Because so much of design engages very, very consciously and actively in speculation. I mean, already inherently, but it's brought much more to the fore recently in terms of speculative design, but also design fiction, which is kind of a very, very narrative heavy approach, where you, exactly what Brian, you said, you try to play with frames of references to see if there's potential future world knowledge inherent in things, And I'm not going to go on about this again, but that's then also again a question of materiality and narration. So I'm just going to drop it though.
I remember someone gave a lecture to me about the context was in architecture, and it was about it was looking at anthropology and various other forms of, let's say, collectivizing or other completely foreign forms of society. For example, like a house in Borneo where the division, there were no walls in the house, and the division of the families was based simply on that each family would inhabit one plank of wood. And so the different families would behave with one another as though, you know, they had no perception of one another. So they would see someone that they maybe were 2 logs across inside their house, and if they saw them outside the house, they would say, "Oh, how are you? I haven't seen you for many months." Like, you know, what's going like. So I guess the purpose of that was something that we're talking about, which is to bring in these different frames of reference. I mean, in that instance, the ultimate goal was something to do with like disassembling capitalism. But so the issue I have with this is that it becomes very, I mean, if you're using that example as something like, basically the problem was that the person presenting it was almost saying that this was inherently liberative. So the question is, how do you, is it enough that a worldview or a frame of reference simply be different to our own, or how do you incorporate these different frames of reference in a beneficial way without saying, well, they're inherently non-capitalist, or they're, you know, simply they're other, or, you know, which is very much the opposite of what it used to be, which is, well, they're barbarians. So, you know, whoever they are, they're barbarian, they're uncivilized. Yeah, so how do you evaluate these new frames of reference is a question.
Any comment on that?
I think that that reminded me of I don't know if everybody's familiar with the Colin Kaepernick kind of protests, probably. But of course, that was a kind of performative event, or continuous performance kind of protest. And the way that a lot of people experienced it was, this person is disrespecting all these people, but it demanded that, and it kind of eventually led to more people developing another narrative lens to view it with. So that's, I don't know if that is helpful to think about, but I just feel like that's one successful version of that. It's not a piece of art, but in a way, it functions like what we're saying that artwork can.
Can you maybe give more context to the change in the narrative, or like?
Well, sure, yeah. So it, you know, they might think, okay, he's kneeling, or he's not standing up to say, you know, for not the Pledge of Allegiance, but the
anthem.
The anthem, right? Yeah, he's not standing up for it. So a lot of people are experiencing this, well, through this narrative of, we stand in order to give respect to to soldiers who are fighting for freedom, and of course, so then they all experience it that way. But eventually, you know, it comes out that you know, it's a very shallow way of viewing what he was doing, and it created a dialogue that I think eventually led to a lot of people, or at least some people, not everyone, of course, to, you know, suspending their conclusions of that they made through that lens, and, you know, wondering about other motives or other reasons behind the protest, and then it, you know, then they can start to see the protest through a different lens of, you know, oppression or police brutality or, you know, racial discrimination and things like that. And that's just a different frame of reference for, you know, why somebody wouldn't stand up for the flag. And then it leads to an aesthetic change in experience when you're viewing it. Now you're not going, oh, this person is, through this narrative of, oh, this person's, you know, disrespecting the flag, you know, they're doing this, and then to changing it to this kind of broader frame of reference of, okay, there's just more going on. And it kind of, I think, can help to expand people's lens in that sense. So maybe, sorry, I don't know if that fits with what Andrew was saying as much, but.
No, I think the connection to the idea of create or using what we were saying about using a worldview that may not be the common experience, and then kind of forcing the observer to either learn about or understand the worldview of the artist that may not be the same as their own in order to interpret the narrative of the artwork. I think it ties to that.
Yeah, that's very good. It's interesting. I mean, in literature, we also have quite some examples where it's very, very clear. There was this thing, Les Bienveillantes, which won the Prix Goncourt, the most important prize for literature in France, when it came out by a guy called Little, I think. And he told the story from the perspective of concentration camp, like the head of a concentration camp, of course, which was like this idea of getting into someone's perspective, into someone's head, basically. That's radically different from the perspective you would have. I think writers have experimented with that in also quite interesting ways. Even though in this case it's not like a perspective you want people to embrace, I suppose, but in other cases it can be more the perspective that you would like people to embrace. Or there's this great book with by André Gide as well, La Symphonie Pastorale, where it's a priest telling a story of how he found a girl who was, I think, deaf-mute, and how he tried to like educate her, and how his son had started to have feelings for that girl, and the girl apparently for the son, and then he separated them violently, and so on and so forth. And as things go, as you read the story through his diary, you realize that actually he has fallen in love with that young girl, but doesn't admit it to himself. And so you kind of have this break with what we call unreliable narrator, of course, where you don't trust what he says anymore. And it's really interesting play, because you have this double perspective where you read one thing being said, and then once you realize that he's not reliable, you ask yourself what it actually means. And then maybe you can come to question the stories you tell yourself and ask yourself how reliable they actually are, and how much of this kind of way of changing the story so you find it acceptable for yourself, might also be at play or at stake in your own stories about yourself.
Can I just say something that keeps coming up in a few of the different texts is, and something I've looked at before, is this idea of making strange, which I think does have a relevance here, because this thing of defamiliarization, that's a different name for this same concept of making strange, that first it was like a literary concept where, and some would basically consider that a definition of art, but basically taking something that we understand or are familiar with and presenting it in such a way whereby it becomes foreign to us, and in that shift we gain a new understanding of that thing. So in a way, that's almost to say that, I mean, if you're saying that is I mean, that doesn't seem like maybe the definition of art I'd use, but if you use that as a working definition, then it's almost like anything that you make sort of reconfigures one's world knowledge or one's understanding of things. So it's not necessarily, you know, so it's a bit different to what we're talking about in terms of, say, frames of reference that might come from other cultures, for example. This is a different way of sort of expanding or reorganizing your worldview, let's say your world knowledge, that comes from sort of the artwork itself. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there are very different processes, I suppose, at play when you take something that's familiar and kind of present it in a strange perspective, right? From an unfamiliar perspective. And yeah, the different attempts at that. There's also What Maisie Knew by Henry James, which is told from the perspective of a little girl. And then she observes something and says there are two adults that get into a fight and describes it. And like the adult reader realized that she's talking about sex, but she doesn't understand it as sex because she doesn't have the concept. And so these kind of strategies of making strange and bringing to the fore narratives that are basically untold somehow, or that are unfamiliar to most people. Yeah, are two different strategies, but both I think relevant and interesting in art, definitely. Other comments? If not, I have a question for Kid. I'm not sure. Because you said like that you were uncomfortable with this idea of the rule making, of the law making kind of theorist, making laws for art. And then you evoke this idea that the artist himself or herself, or how would you say the neutral, by the way?
How would you say what?
How would you say? Because I remember that you once told Jesse that him or herself.
Oh, they, yeah, right.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay, that they would also bring in world knowledge and have sort of an idea of the world knowledge of the viewer, and would try to fashion the work based on their vision of the world knowledge of the viewer. But you called it the circularity, and that's where I didn't quite understand in what way you thought it was circular, to give rules or to like. Yeah.
Well, so I think there. Let me try to frame this. I think there are. I guess in reading the and we were talking about specifically the Peter Hoon paper. It seemed to me that there may have been this kind of the circularity of thinking that you are present, like from the artist's perspective or from the creator's perspective, that it's almost a narrow way of thinking that an artist in creating a work in order to communicate a certain thing is going to be focused squarely upon their own worldview, when in reality the artist is aware that they are creating for an artist that has a worldview, and that the goal is to actually work within the context of the observer's worldview and not the artist's worldview, right? Does that make sense? So it seems like it was kind of narrowly focused on this idea that the artist's narrative is based upon the creator's worldview and not the supposed audience's worldview. And I think when you and maybe I'm just inserting that filter on it. But to me, I think there's a lot of focus on I think it's important to kind of bring it full circle and think of it in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I understand a bit better. I mean, I think that Huhn is actually more interested in like how the worldview of the viewer kind of helps them understand the narrative being conveyed. So there is one writer who really thinks about like how artworks convey worldviews. I can't remember the name right now. It's in Story Worlds, the journal called Story Worlds. But here in Huhn, it's more like the puzzle of like, how do you understand the artwork? And so I think it's actually from a viewer perspective, more than like from a creative perspective. What do you think, Susie? You're the expert.
Yeah, I mean, not an expert, but yeah, I think I would agree given my reading of that text. I'm interested in this idea of eventfulness that he uses as this kind of framing device, and thinking about that in terms of curatorial practice and how, in a way, you can think of, well, this idea of the pregnant moment maybe being a useful framing device for putting together, say, I mean, an exhibition, for example, where you take some idea of the pregnant moment around a particular theme or idea, and use that as a kind of useful space where different narratives can be framed in relation to each other, which can both make some new or previously unseen narratives visible or legible, whilst kind of simultaneously expanding what we're thinking of as, you know, sort of like world knowledge or some kind of common knowledge, at least for whoever comes into contact with that particular space. So yeah, I thought that's a useful way to think about the pregnant moment in relation to my work, anyway.
It's very interesting indeed. I mean, now that I just listened to you, I think like the difference we were struggling to make as well with Andrew is like the difference between what stories are being told and how are stories being told, right? And in the case of not standing up for the anthem, it's a bit of both, but it's like, how do I tell this specific story of someone deciding not to kneel and lift his fist instead of standing up for the anthem? But also, what stories do I then bring in to tell this story differently? Whereas with the stories of, for instance, say colonialization being told from the perspective of the colonized, there are also stories that haven't been told yet that are then being told, and so on and so forth. So I think there are these both aspects. And the estrangement is more about telling a story differently, how you tell it, rather than like introducing a new story. Other remarks? One thing that's it's a bit more technical, but Huhn, as you rightly said, Susie, doesn't want to say that a picture can really tell a story, but he comes very close to it, and he says like it totally evokes it, given your world knowledge, and so on and so forth. And he makes this difference between illustration and autonomous storytelling as well, which is actually, I think, a difference that's difficult to make. And he kind of shifts ground, as most people who make this difference between illustration is something where you need previous knowledge of the story being told, which is actually a reception-centered explanation of illustration. And illustration is what illustrates our already known story, which is a more production-centered definition. And as if these two things always went together, but arguably they don't. You can tell a story that has already been told and thereby illustrating, and yet making it understandable, I think, without people already knowing this story. And devices to do so, of course, I mean, it would be relatively easy in a movie to retell a story. So it would be illustration of a verbal story, but it doesn't mean that it's not understandable without people knowing that story already. And here, like Kuhn and others, Mary Lorraine does it as well. They behave as if this always went together. And in some cases, you will also have something tell a story. Did I speak of Jericho's Raft of Medusa in the context of this class or not? The Raft of Medusa, which you may know, is this big painting that tells a very specific, refers to a very specific context in 19th century France. It's a painting by Jericho, and actually you do, so it's an illustration of an actual event, but you can understand the basic idea even if you don't know the event. So you could have an illustration that's an illustration on in one sense, but is autonomous in the other, right? So you do understand that a story is being told and what that story is without actually knowing the original story. And maybe the story will be more partial and it won't have the name of the people and it won't have the historical context and so on and so forth, but it could still be a full-blown story. And actually, I'll show it to you just to like tell you what I mean. Here we go. So yeah. So that's the painting. It's hanging in the Louvre. It's very big, and even if you don't know the historical context, which is of a raft, of a ship going down, and then because they have a commander who's not well trained and who was put in place by a new government just because he was favored by the government. And then they build this raft and most people die and there are only a few survivors, and here you see the survivors. But even if you don't know the story, you can see a story of a shipwreck where you see that people have been suffering, that some are already dead. The father here is kind of contemplating the death of what's usually taken to be his son. People have suffered from shark attacks and so on and so forth. And you also see, when you look long enough, that there's a moment of hope happening here, and people are actually gesticulating towards the horizon. And when you look close enough, you see that there is a boat appearing at the horizon, which is hardly visible now through the pixels, but you can actually see it in the Louvre. So this picture arguably tells a full-blown story of shipwreck and the discovery of a boat that's potentially going to save them. So it has a problem and a resolution within one image, even though it's an illustration. It's understandable without knowing the actual historical context, but based on world knowledge. And of course, if you've never seen a raft, if you don't know what that shipwreck can happen, so a little child wouldn't understand much of it because it wouldn't have the necessary world knowledge. But this world knowledge is not only constituted by formal narratives, but also by knowledge about causal connections, the fact that people at sea might die of thirst or of hunger, all these kind of knowledge, which you may sometimes come to learn through narratives, but also through our own experience, or just because someone explicitly tells us these things, will then allow you to read it. And I think who doesn't want to make the path to then say it tells a story because you have to bring in all these kind of knowledge. I think he kind of is posing a problem because even literary narratives are never full in the way that he would expect. So then if you say that world knowledge can't be brought in, or something will cease to be a full-blown autonomous narrative, then you will have to say, okay, most novels are not telling stories either, because they also rely on world knowledge in much similar ways. So I think his analysis is quite correct, that this world knowledge is essential and so on and so forth, but it's not only essential for pictorial narratives. And as you wouldn't want to say that literary narratives are not narratives, or that fairy tales are not narratives, yet they also need knowledge, then you should give up the idea that pictures can't tell stories. I mean, to make a long story short, but that's maybe the more technical aspect of his argument.
I think that maybe was the observation that was closer to the point that I was trying to make, actually, was
Okay.
that, yeah, that, and I think it's also, it's important to realize that I think when we talk about analytical texts, I mean, they're primarily written, if you take the three roles of artist, curator, and you know, observer, right? The analytical texts are basically like this one, are written primarily from the perspective of the curator, right? We're trying to impose some kind of structure upon all of artness, right? And so I think again, the problem that I have with like Lessing and Goodman are that the imposition of rules for the purpose of creating structure, saying that things should be done a certain way is really, because you're not going to control the allness of art. So what you're really talking about is what should be seen, or worse, what should be made, right? And from a curatorial standpoint, I think that's overstepping. And that's, of course, that's my own personal viewpoint. But.
Yeah, comments on that?
I think I'd kind of I would kind of agree with that, definitely. What I just keep finding very interesting is how closely all the narrative, or quite a few of the narrative accounts, are to how closely linked they are to very computationalist ideas, oddly, which kind of makes sense. Well, it's not really odd, it does make sense, but for example, Hühnen, what he sets up when he refers to frames and scripts, he refers to, I didn't take very good notes, but Someone and Abelson, who are very much like what I keep talking about, like Coxeye computationalists, definitely, or at least on just briefly reading up on it. That's very much what it strikes me as. So I think what's really interesting is that there seems to be constantly this kind of like back and forth between things on the aesthetic level and also on the like effective level, kind of, but then also the deep research-driven or discipline-driven need to formalize that into, for example, very flat notions of scripts and frames and things like that, which, and I'm gonna hit materiality again, because that is very, very similar to, for example, some notions of, like, for example, actor network theory, or object-oriented ontology to some extent, which kind of, like, when you speak of world knowledge, you imply that there's a knowledge, but there's also rules for that knowledge that aren't the same as the scripts, kind of. So there's tacit, situated, distributed, embodied, kind of like all these kinds of connections to the scripts that aren't formalizable, and also, as Kit kind of said, to a lot of extents also probably shouldn't be, and that's fine to some extent. That's just something I keep noticing, this kind of like, I mean, it makes a lot of sense because, like, inherently, in terms of cybernetics, for example, and those kind of thoughts of the 20s and 30s, like those ideas of formalism, they all have their semantic layer, and I guess that's kind of like a common root of both, like, thinking in terms of this scripting and kind of like these computational ideas, and that's kind of where I'm going.
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting because you seem to, at least Kid and Jesse, you're voicing this this discomfort with the kind of explicit dichotomies and so on, and these distinctions. I personally have kind of, and this is going to be a disclosure, but it's probably not a surprise at this point of the class. I've always kind of agreed with Deleuze and Guattari's vision of philosophy as creating concepts. And for me, it's like, it's really the core of the philosophical and maybe even theoretical activity is to try and draw distinctions between things and trying to make explicit what we experience intuitively. And to kind of find the words and then rework the words maybe, and maybe sometimes challenge them, but trying to figure out how things that can seem different, like two different artworks, are at the same time similar in one respect because they somehow use the same device, or how there's two ways of showing temporality. Either you choose the pregnant moment, one moment, or you show several moments, right? Monochrony, polychrony. It just seems like then maybe you need to add some more, and I tried to add some more categories, like what I called ionochrony. There seem to be pictures that show eternity, right? Or that at least aspire at showing an eternal kind of state. When you show the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, it would be like an ever existing state. And then you have achronous pictures that show no moment at all. Like when you show a little man for a toilet, doesn't seem to show any moment. It's still a picture. So there's some pictures where the question of time is not even relevant. But then I would say at one point, you have kind of exhausted the realm of possibilities, and eventually every picture will fall into one or several of these categories. And personally, I would have the feeling that I kind of have understood better how pictures work if I'm aware of these different categories, and can maybe even like also work more consciously on using them when I create art myself. So when I know what are the different things that I can possibly move, and then of course I can suddenly, being a 21st century artist, to start challenging monochrony. And a vast majority, I would say 99% of the artists active today making pictures, make monochronous pictures. There's no polychrony. The futurists did it a little bit, but it's like a little moment, like a girl running on a balcony and so on. But apart from that, everybody sticks to the idea that one picture, one frame, one moment, for instance, right? And I would think that looking at the different devices that exist and that have existed, you can actually, also find ways to actually launch these challenges that are interesting. But maybe I kind of, I'm thinking I need to advocate for an idea that I don't need to advocate for. I don't know, but I wanted to make this kind of call for the usefulness of these distinctions. Not necessarily dichotomic, or could be trichotomic, or five, or how many.
Well, I would just caveat what you just said by the fact that I still think it has to do with the delineation of what you allow in and what you push out that determines whether that's valid, right? I mean, basically just saying that artists aren't creating, and the terms are just out of my head, but basically the types of polychronic versus monochronic. Well, I mean, there are scores of sequential artists who are creating singular artworks that are framed, right? That, I mean, a comic book page is a singular piece of art and also a sequential piece of art, right?
Yeah, I agree.
So I think it's still, and that's just, I mean, that's a very
comic books. I didn't think of that. You're right.
It's a very mundane example, but it speaks to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It speaks to that delineation of what's in and what's out, and what we recognize as art versus what we don't. Or
that's for sure. I mean, the question then is, once you have these categories, if you admit of overlaps, and if you admit of blurry boundaries and all that, So for me, maybe that's where I would be different from Lessing, in kind of embracing the blurry boundaries, and in thinking with Wittgenstein that a concept is not useless because it has blurry boundaries. Quite the opposite. Using the example of games, of course, in Wittgenstein, concepts can be operational precisely because they have blurry boundaries, and because we're not always able to, and it doesn't make them inoperational. Actually, we perfectly know how to use the concept of game most of the times, and yet we couldn't spell out what the explicit criteria is for something to be included in this category. But still, I would think that that making the differences first, or at one point, and yet admitting of blurring and overlaps and so on, would be for me more productive than to say the single artwork is just a single occurrence. And I don't say that that's where you're going, but it would be like the radical opposing perspective, the casuistic perspective, something that art historians are also tend to be very uncomfortable with conceptual distinctions, because they say, no, but in my painter, it's totally different. And most of the times you're like, no, it's not totally different, because at one point, you know, something either shows one or several moments or both, but that's it, you know what I mean? So yeah, that's the sort of the worry I have, to fall into like, we can't say anything anymore because everything is specific somehow. Yeah, are there other things we want to address? I've been keeping you while I was speaking on. Sorry, that was kind of sorry, like speaking at you on my screen without realizing. Okay, but you heard me. Yeah. Are there any other things that you would like to address before this class slowly ends? No, I don't see any urgent needs. Do you want to see the Dürer painting I spoke, the Dürer drawing quickly, of Adam and Eve as being depicted in a sort of, for me, interesting, like non-culping, inculping way? I'll briefly show it to you if you're willing. So this would be a more traditional depiction, also by Dürer. Do you see Dürer now, or Rembrandt? This one. So this picture, right? Where even though, no, not even, because he already has an apple, she also has an apple, you don't really know who's like to be blamed. But the version of Rembrandt here, I mean, that's like clearly who's the culprit, as the culprit. And you would like wonder how an Adam who's shocked like that could ever be brought to eat this apple, right? Do you see the pictures as I speak about it, or you see the Rembrandt right now, like this very sketchy drawing? Because I'm not quite sure what you see on your screens.
I'm just seeing the Dürer right now.
Oh, you still see the Dürer. Ah, okay, that's why. Okay, I have to shift it. Ah. Mm-hmm. I have to change my screen share options so you see what I see. Desktop. Okay, I'll just share the desktop. It's going to be easier for changing. But so that would be like where you don't really see the first one, because like both have an apple. Then you have this version by Rembrandt. Now you see it, right? With Eve handing over the apple and Adam like being totally scared and what the hell are you doing, handing me that thing where it's forbidden and so on. And you wonder like how Eve could ever have convinced, she must really be a bad seductress to have him convinced to eat that apple after he reacted like that in the first place. And then you compare this, and that's the one I personally like most, to that depiction where you kind of have the feeling they're like at a party and trying a new drug together, you know, like how they're embraced, this loving embrace. Eve has her arm around Adam's neck. Adam holds Eve by the hip. They both touch the apple simultaneously, and there's no more culpability here. It's a totally different story. It's the same biblical story. This one is somewhat similar to that rendering. where we see them from the front, but here still you have the snake handing down the apple to Eve, and Adam seems to be arguing with his hand. So here it's like really pushing this idea of like a common mistake much further. And of course, with an image like that, the role you would give Eve would be very different than when you have it like that. So that's like how I think different renderings of a well-known story can lead to very different effects. And I wonder what would be an equivalent for that today. I mean, I think it would also be an interesting field of exploration, of like, even for a single artist to try and shift the way the story is being told in images. Okay, well, you all seem a bit exhausted. So I'm still at 100, but I really enjoyed doing that class with you, and I hope you also took something away, even though of course there are always areas that are not treated materiality. I'll definitely put it on my list to be more to see what there is about material in narratives, and some other topics that we talked about. But yeah, if there's no last word on your side, well then, heavy-heartedly declare this class ended. And if you want to go deeper into the question of narratives in art, I'll be doing a class in the next semester with the new center where we'll really deep dive into this question. I found today's debate one of the most interesting ones personally, so I would be happy if some of you were joining for that too, and maybe we can discuss artworks and exchange more ideas. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Klaus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.